The folk horror genre has seen a rise in popularity since its original sighting in 1970s Britain. In recent years, there has been an increased interest in folk horror films, notably The Witch, Apostle, and Midsommar, amongst others. While the genre and its subsequent culture can be a broad topic, it's easier to analyse when referring to these three themes. Folklore. Stories of cultural or local significance, for example Stonehenge or the Pied Piper. Rural nature worship. Covered by a number of religions, the spiritual understanding of or connection to nature. Sinister undertones. The horror in folk horror, varying across each medium a dark underlying tone. These aren't rules but guides to help us identify a consistent tone and theme across the genre. Before we get into the modern media, let's take a look at where it all began. The roots of folk horror can be found in Celtic history, paganism, and a rebellion or disengagement from organised religion. Whilst factual evidence of the Celtic Druids is scarce, their legend and lore has lived on for centuries. What we know as neo-paganism, Wicca, and witchcraft were part of a rise in alternative religions in the early 19th century. This is often referred to as the occult revival. Like many religions, neo-paganism and Wicca will have a variety of alternative views and practices. However, only come Macbeth had a thorough image of a witch being created. Also, during the 1600s, the infamous Salem witch trials would be conducted. The origin of the evil depiction of witchcraft comes from Christian beliefs or superstition. It wouldn't be until as late as the 20th century that people would self-identify as a witch while adopting the neo-paganism religions, and the variants will generally be moulded to suit different beliefs. However, Gerald Gardner is noted as being the catalyst that brought Wicca into the public view. In the 1940s, using a number of sources including ceremonial magic and literature by Aleister Crowley, Gardner created Gardnerian Wicca. A number of alternative Wiccan religions would also be popularised across Britain. A large part of these religions involves nature worship in a variety of ways. The film Hexam is an early representation of witchcraft and the resulting panic from Christian views. From there, films such as The Seventh Victim in 1943 would depict a cult of devil worshippers in New York. These films represent the views of organised religion that only fueled the growth of alternative groups. This depiction of religion turning against opposers and the cult-like activity symbolises the critical view a growing portion of Western society had towards Christianity. In the late 60s and through the 70s, what can be considered the golden age of horror films, a number of productions would focus on witchcraft and alternative religions, beginning with the Witchfinder General, a story of a witch hunter that visits villages in rural England. 1971 would see the release of The Blood on Satan's Claw, another British horror film that focuses this time on a ritualistic cult that perform a black mass. 2 years later, The Wicca Man would be released in 1973. Again, a British production, The Wicca Man focuses on an island that have converted to a Celtic paganism from Christianity. The story is told from the views of the Christian protagonist. Whether or not these films were created as a tongue-in-cheek depiction of Christian hysteria, or as a critique of the emerging alternative religions, the thought process of religious panic was being depicted, and it would only stem and grow into entire subcultures, a different way of living without religion. There is also a selection of literature cited as being early originators of the folk horror genre. However, to be defined as folk horror is a relatively contemporary phenomenon. By using the three main themes of folk horror and creating the atmosphere of the supernatural landscape, these authors have been connected to folk horror in hindsight. Edwardian author M.R. James is a widely accredited author in his own right. At least a selection of his stories can be considered part of the folk horror genre. James utilised themes such as haunting, supernatural lore, and malevolence. Using the setting of East Anglia, the same as the Witchfinder General, is an area of England still considered relatively rural, which would of course help to create an atmosphere through nature and folklore. His stories A Warning to the Curious, Oh Whistle and I'll Come to You My Lad, and Casting the Runes, each use an object with supernatural powers as a plot device, such as a cursed whistle or a lost crown of Anglia. James's work can be seen as creating folklore in itself. Shirley Jackson's short story The Lottery is set in a small American town. The community vote on a local resident to be stoned to death for the greater good of the town. The story includes references to agriculture and tradition, reminiscent of the deep nature worship connections to the pagan harvest. The eerie congregation of the town conforming to a norm of their society can be seen as an exaggerated metaphor for religion and/or prosecution, a trial not dissimilar to that of classic horror literature such as Frankenstein or historical witch trials. Harvest Home by Thomas Tryon is a novel about a fictional town that have formed a cult-like consideration of the pagan harvest. Using a rural Connecticut setting, Harvest Home uses the lore of the harvest, the predecessor of Halloween, to create a horror story of sinister cult activity. These two latter stories are an example of folk horror set outside the British Isles. Every location will have its own folklore, such as the European Krampus, Japanese Namahage, and South American Chupacabra. As a result, it seems fair to say that the folk horror genre will be able to stem from these tales to create a unique regional story with its own religious connection. Considering this, there are examples of international folk horror, such as Japanese horror films Kuroniko and Kaiden. These two films are based upon Japanese folk stories, of which there are plenty to use as creepy source material. The genre isn't limited to films and literature though. A plethora of art can be associated with the folk horror genre. If the images or atmosphere created tells a story or creates the familiar feeling reminiscent of folk horror, it tends to be adopted by the subculture. The Folk Horror Revival group are currently pioneering the subculture, collecting an archive of media, interviews and discussions to keep the subculture moving and spreading awareness. They're a fantastic asset to the community. Folk horror, like many horror genres, can be controversial, separating opinion and creating discussion. Perhaps it's best to refer to the genre as having a cult following, with critical acclaim. While the contemporary media isn't universally adored, it is certainly appreciated. Hopefully the genre will develop to create modern variants depicting the religious growth and folklore across many countries and cultures. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, please do like, comment or subscribe.